welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle a question that's been kind of swirling around online a bit. Is Neil Gaiman, and I bet you know who Neil Gaiman is, author of Sandman, American Gods, Coraline, is he secretly still a Scientologist?
Oh, that's a really good question. And we have some pretty interesting sources for this deep dive. We've got a blog post on Vox Populi. We also have a 2013 interview from The Guardian, and even a copy of The Auditor Worldwide from 1986.
So yeah, I mean, this isn't just like some random fan theory floating out there. There's actual documentation that puts Gaiman, within the Church of Scientology. So, for someone who's been so successful in this world of fantasy and imagination, this real-life mystery is it's pretty captivating, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And it really gets to the heart of what we do here. We're sifting through information, finding the connections, and seeing what conclusions we can draw. Now, you might be thinking, wait, hasn't Gaiman denied any involvement with Scientology?
Yeah.
And you'd be right, he has. But the details are where things get really interesting.
Okay, so let's start with that Guardian interview from 2013. It came out, I think, right around the time his book, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, was released. And the interviewer directly addressed those rumors about his Scientology ties.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is how Gaiman responded. He said, and this is a quote, "I haven't been a practicing Scientologist since I was in my 20s.
Okay.
So he's not denying past involvement, but he's definitely emphasizing the word practicing.
So that's very carefully chosen wording, right? Does that leave the door open for some kind of affiliation, even if he's not actively participating?
It definitely raises some questions, and to understand those questions, we need to understand a bit about Scientology itself. At its core, Scientology believes that humans are spiritual beings called theans who have forgotten their true nature, and through a process called auditing, Scientologists aim to achieve spiritual enlightenment and freedom.
So what does auditing actually involve? What do they do?
Okay, well, it's kind of like a one-on-one counseling session where an auditor uses an e-meter, and this is a device that measures electrical changes in the body. They use that to help the individual identify and address areas of spiritual distress.
Okay.
Now back to Gaiman. We have this really fascinating document, The Auditor Worldwide from 1986, and guess what?
What?
Neil Gaiman is listed as Auditor #202.
Auditor #202. That's not just like attending a Sunday service, right? That suggests some serious involvement.
Exactly. To become an auditor, you have to undergo extensive training. You have to pass a series of exams. It's a really significant commitment within the Church of Scientology. And according to this document, Gaiman completed several Scientology courses between the ages of 26 and 28.
Wow, so we're not talking about some teenage flirtation with a belief system.
Yeah.
Right? This is during a period when he was already establishing himself as a writer.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really starting to paint a different picture.
Yeah. It is. It adds more pieces to the puzzle. And if you're wondering why this information is coming from a blog post on Vox Populi, it's important to understand the context.
Right.
Vox Populi is a blog known for its conservative political commentary, and the author of this particular post was digging into Gaiman's background, perhaps looking for inconsistencies or hidden agendas.
Ah, so even the source itself is part of the story here. We're not just dealing with facts, right? We're dealing with interpretations, motivations, maybe even a bit of a hidden agenda on the part of the blog author?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
That's the beauty of a deep dive. We're peeling back the layers, considering all the angles. Now, there's one more piece of evidence from this Vox Populi blog that adds another layer of intrigue.
Okay, let's hear it.
A 2009 newsletter from Scientology's Cornerstone Group lists Neil and his then-wife, Mary Gaiman, as members in good standing with a $35,000 donation.
Wait. $35,000. That's not just dropping a few bucks in the collection plate, That's a significant level of financial support.
Yeah, it certainly is. And it makes you wonder, what does in good standing even mean in the context of Scientology? What level of involvement does that imply?
So we've gone from not practicing to auditor #202 to a hefty donation and being in good standing.
Mm-hmm.
This is starting to feel like a real-life detective story.
It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it all begs the question, if Gaiman was so involved in Scientology during his formative years as a writer, how much did that influence his work? But that's a discussion for later.
You got it. We've laid out the basic facts, or at least what we know so far, about Gaiman's connection to Scientology. But before we jump into all the implications, I think we need to understand a bit more about the church itself, especially its founder, L. Ron Hubbard, because there's some intriguing parallels there.
I agree. Understanding Hubbard's story, particularly his background as a science fiction writer, will shed light on some of the theories surrounding Gaiman's success. Okay, so let's talk about L. Ron Hubbard for a minute. He was, of course, the founder of Scientology, but before that, he was actually a pretty prolific science fiction writer.
Yeah, I remember reading Battlefield Earth back in the day. It
Yeah.
was, well, let's just say it was a pretty wild ride.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. Hubbard wrote dozens of books and short stories, and his science fiction background actually played a significant role in shaping the beliefs and practices of Scientology. For example, the concept of athetans, those spiritual beings we talked about earlier, has roots in his science fiction writings.
Interesting. So is there like a connection between Hubbard's writing career and his success in establishing Scientology? Like, is there something there?
There definitely is. Scientology, like from its early days, encouraged its members to buy like multiple copies of Hubbard's books.
Oh, wow.
And this practice, along with some pretty aggressive marketing tactics, helped inflate his book sales and contributed to his image as like a best-selling author.
Okay, so that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Are we suggesting that something similar could be happening with Gaiman's books?
It's a question worth considering. We know Gaiman has a huge fan base. His books have sold millions of copies worldwide. But what if, and this is just a what if, a portion of those sales is driven by Scientologists, similar to what happened with Hubbard?
That's a pretty bold claim. Do we have any, like, evidence to support that?
Not directly. We don't have access to Gaiman's sales figures or, data on who's buying his books. But it's an interesting thought experiment, isn't it? Like, if a significant portion of Hubbard's sales were artificially inflated by Scientologists, could something similar be happening, even on a smaller scale, with Gaiman?
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. It kind of makes you look at his success through a different lens, right?
Exactly. It's not about discrediting Gaiman's talent or his achievements, but about understanding the potential influence of, like, these external factors.
This whole conversation about Scientology and book sales, it reminded me of something. Remember that episode of The Simpsons where Gaiman makes a cameo appearance?
You mean the book job? Yes, I remember that one. He plays a rather scheming, possibly illiterate author who steals Lisa's work.
Right. And it's a hilarious episode.
Mm.
But it also kind of got me thinking, is there a deeper meaning behind that satirical portrayal? Could it be like a reflection of some underlying suspicions surrounding Gaiman and his success, perhaps even, linked to Scientology?
That's a fascinating question. Satire often holds a grain of truth, even if it's exaggerated for comedic effect.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if the writers of The Simpsons were, tapping into some public perception of Gaiman, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah. So we have this, blog post digging into Gaiman's past involvement with Scientology, and then we have The Simpsons kind of poking fun at his authorial integrity, even if, in a lighthearted way. Is it possible that these two seemingly unrelated things are actually connected by, like, some underlying current of suspicion or skepticism?
It's certainly possible, and it speaks to the power of pop culture to reflect and even shape our perceptions of, public figures.
Yeah. As we're going through all this, it's hard not to think about what this means for Gaiman's work itself. If he was, like, deeply involved in Scientology during, like, his formative years as a writer, how much did that influence his stories?
Right. That's a question that a lot of fans have been asking. Some have even gone back and re-examined his books, looking for hidden meanings or connections to Scientology.
Yeah. And have they found anything? Like, what have they found?
Well, there are definitely some interesting parallels. For example, in American Gods, Gaiman explores the idea of, old gods and new gods battling for power, which could be seen as a metaphor for the clash between like traditional belief systems and modern ideologies.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and in Neverwhere, he creates, like, this hidden world beneath London. It's like this secret society with its own rules and rituals. That could be interpreted as a reflection of Scientology's own secretive nature.
Right, right. Of course, these are just interpretations. It's impossible to say for sure whether these themes were, consciously influenced by Gaiman's involvement with Scientology.
But it definitely adds another layer of intrigue to his work, right?
Yeah.
Like, are we reading these stories as intended, or are we projecting, like, our own knowledge of his background onto them?
It's a valid question, and it highlights the complex relationship between an author's life and their art,
So where does all of this leave us? We've got some pretty compelling evidence that Gaiman was deeply involved in Scientology at one point.
Hmm.
We know that L. Ron Hubbard used his position as the leader of Scientology to boost his own book sales.
Hmm.
And we've seen how pop culture, in the form of The Simpsons, has kind of satirized Gaiman in a way that could be interpreted as, suspicious.
Right. But it's important to remember that, we're dealing with a lot of speculation here. We don't have definitive proof that Gaiman is still a Scientologist or that his book sales have been artificially inflated.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they do with all this information?
Well, I think the key takeaway is to approach this topic with an open mind and a healthy dose of skepticism. Don't jump to conclusions, but don't dismiss the evidence either.
Yeah. It's like we've given you a bunch of puzzle pieces. Now it's up to you to kind of put them together and see what picture emerges.
And maybe, just maybe, those puzzle pieces will lead you to ask some interesting questions about Gaiman's work, about Scientology, and about the, relationship between belief and creativity.
It's really fascinating to see how these, different pieces of information, like from that Vox Populi blog post to like The Simpsons, it's like they kind of create this whole conversation around Gaiman and Scientology.
Yeah, it shows how interconnected our world is, like how even like a seemingly throwaway joke in a cartoon can tie into like this larger cultural discourse.
Right. And for you listening, what do you make of all of this? Does it change how you view Gaiman's work? Does it make you curious to dig deeper into Scientology itself?
Remember, we're not here to tell you what to think, just to encourage you to think, critically.
Exactly. We've laid out the evidence, we've laid out the context, the different perspectives. Now it's up to you to form your own conclusions.
And if this deep dive sparks your curiosity to explore further, then I'd say we've done our job.
As we wrap up, I keep coming back to Gaiman's own words in that Guardian interview.
Yeah, that not practicing statement.
Right. It's such carefully worded phrasing, and it
Yeah.
leaves so much open to interpretation.
It's almost like he's inviting us to read between the lines.
Maybe that's part of his artistry. Gaiman's always been a master of ambiguity, of blurring the lines between reality and fantasy.
And perhaps that's what makes this whole situation so captivating. It's like one of his stories come to life, full of mystery and intrigue.
So if you're a fan of Neil Gaiman, maybe this deep dive has given you a new lens through which to, view his work. Maybe you'll see hidden meanings, or maybe you'll appreciate his artistry on a whole new level.
And if you're not familiar with Gaiman's work, maybe this will pique your interest. Check out his books, explore his worlds, and see what resonates with you.
This deep dive it's been a journey through rumors and evidence and speculation, all revolving around the question of Neil Gaiman's relationship with Scientology.
And ultimately, it's a journey that leaves us with more questions than answers. But that's the beauty of a good mystery, right?
It keeps us thinking, it keeps us exploring, it keeps us engaged with the world around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep seeking those hidden truths.